All right, well, again, welcome everybody. Tonight we have Susan Carpenter with us. She is the native plant garden curator and gardener at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum. Since 2003, she has worked with students and community volunteers to maintain and monitor a 4-acre garden representing the plant communities of southern Wisconsin. She also leads a conservation project that involves students and the public in documenting and studying native bumblebees, including the endangered rusty patch bumblebee Bombus affinis. A graduate of Stanford University, Susan earned her BS in botany and BS in science education at UW-Madison. Her professional interests include plant ecology, ecological restoration, pollinator conservation, and science education. So thank you, Susan, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for inviting me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Whoops. Okay, here we are. This should be the beginning of the program. Does that look good, Jess?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk today. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and the wonderful invitation to speak with you. I kind of wish that I were there in person tonight, but this is the next best thing to that. I'm so glad that so many people are interested in this topic and able to join us tonight. So I will be talking about native bees, and this will be bumblebees, of course, but you're going to get a really good visual idea of how many other native bees there are in Wisconsin. I won't be really talking about honeybees in detail, although I will call out honeybees in my discussion of how many native bees and all the different types of bees there are in the state. So we will touch on that, but I'm not going to go deep on honeybees. I'm not as knowledgeable about honeybees, but I can share some information with you about them. Okay, so just to get started, kind of set a context, I kind of want to share with you what the importance of pollination by pollinators is. And we know there are many kinds of pollinators, but let's think of it from the plant side first. So 75% of the world's food crops, so this is crops used by humans, and animals perhaps, but crops that are used for food depend at least in part on pollination. So some crops are wind pollinated, so that wouldn't be a case of insect pollination, of course, but many of the crops, 75%, are dependent at least in part on pollination. So they produce better fruit, better seed, more seed if they have been pollinated, mediated pollination by insects or animals. And 90%, if we think about the wild plants that really form the basis of the food webs and of our of all the other animals that depend on plants, which is all of us, 90% of those wild plants are dependent to some extent on animal pollination. That's almost all of them. There are 20,000 species of just wild bees worldwide, 20,000. And we also know there are other types of pollinators. There are butterflies, moths, wasps, beetles, birds, bats, and other animals too that can contribute to pollination. For the most part, I'll be focusing on more the insects, tonight. But I will touch on our one species of pollinating bird, which is our hummingbird in Wisconsin. And when we think about how many species of wild bees there are, and these other groups, especially the butterfly group, we know now that 40% of those invertebrate pollinator species are facing extinction. So they're in decline or they are close to extinction. And so we keep that in mind as well. Just these numbers put together, if you sort of think about them all as a whole, are pretty startling and pretty stark. So tonight, what I'd like to do is do a pollinator overview for Wisconsin. This will just be looking at the major groups and a little bit about how you might be able to become a photographer of insects, as it happens to most of us who start working on bumblebee ID, and learn a lot more about what insects there are in your garden or in the natural areas that you visit, and civic spaces and so forth. So pollinator overview will delve a little bit more deeply into the life history of bees, and we'll look at the stressors. And by stressors, I mean, what are the things that are impacting these pollinators in a negative way? And then as we think about that, we can think about what are some things that we can actually do that are actions on our part as gardeners, as community members, as teachers, as naturalists, people who work with others and teach others about gardening and about conservation. What can we do to ameliorate some of those stressors, and at least be aware of them so that we can spread the word for others to help us in conservation? And then I will use as an example the way that anybody who's on the call tonight, I'm sure some of you are already members of the Bumblebee Brigade. I hope so. Bumblebee Brigade is a Wisconsin DNR project, and it is a way to monitor bumblebees anywhere using photography. So I'll get into that a little bit, because I'm hoping now, as we're moving toward spring, that we'll have more and more people getting involved with that project. And I'll tell you a lot more about it later on. So let's start with the big groups of pollinators. And these are, I'll start with butterflies and moths. So on the left-hand side, we have a couple of examples of butterflies, a fritillary there, and then obviously the monarch, which is at the lower left. And then we have on the right-hand side, the upper right is a clear wing moth, day-flying moth. And you can see the wing is rather transparent. It's visiting flocks, and it is a fairly large insect. That is probably, you can tell from the phlox flower, but it's probably about 2 inches long. This is the larger of the two species. And it has a very long proboscis, like a butterfly. So it can uncurl its proboscis and put it down into that tubular flower of the phlox. You can see the flower has a very long tube where the nectar is held. And then at the bottom lower right, we have the 8-spotted forester moth, another day-flying moth with a striking black and white pattern and those orange structures near the head. Now, all the pictures that you're going to see in this presentation, I think without exception, are pictures that I took of insects while I was out monitoring bumblebees with my camera. So that is the benefit of having your camera with you, just taking pictures of you'll be ending up taking pictures of pretty much every insect that you can and that you can see. And there are good ways to identify these. I am not an entomologist by training, but I will tell you that wisconsinbutterflies.org is an excellent website for you to learn a lot about Wisconsin butterflies, including locations, phenology, when they're being found. And then bugguide.net is another resource that you can use where you send your pictures in. And that's how I get some of my identifications. I submit my photos on the website, and and then experts there will be identifying them. And you get an email that says, oh, your picture was identified, and you can find out what it was, which is wonderful, because experts can usually determine identifications from pictures much more easily than amateurs can. So it's a good way, if you have good pictures, to get identifications and get that going. So I do encourage you to feel free to take pictures of all of the insects that you can find. Here are some flies and beetles, another important group. And there you can see there's tremendous variety. The flies are the ones at the top and then on the lower right. And the one at the lower left is a beetle. that can also fly, but it has those hard covers over the wings. So it's in this case, it's just crawling around in the flower. And these are insects which are they're eating pollen in some cases, but they're also accidentally spreading pollen. They're not gathering pollen on purpose. They're just kind of spreading it as they move from flower to flower. So a leaf-footed fly here, and you can see this one in the upper right looks like a bumblebee. And for the briefest moment, I thought it was a bumblebee, but when I got closer and focused in on it, I could see that its eyes are huge and it has little tiny antenna, almost no antenna. And then it only has 2 wings, and it wasn't even behaving like a bumblebee. So it looks like a bumblebee, but it's a fly mimic of a bumblebee. So that was a great one to send in and get an identification on that. The smaller fly here in the center of a daisy type flower is another fly that has a little bit of warning coloration on it, maybe looking a little bit like a kind of a chubby wasp, but lots of mimicry in the insect groups. But you can see clearly on that one, large eyes, no antenna to speak of, and just 2 wings, which would classify it into the flies. Again, these were identified on bugguide.net. At the end of the talk, you will have a link to what is basically a handout, and that handout will have the information like these addresses, these different resources that I'm referring to in the talk. So you can access that through the link, and you'll have access to all the resources that I mentioned and some extras. Another important group of pollinators is wasps, and they visit flowers for nectar, but they do not collect pollen because they feed their young, actually, other insects. So here we see a lot of variety in the wasps. They have no hairs on them to speak of. They're a variety of sizes. You can see that one at the lower left here is on a rattlesnake master. So that wasp is about an inch long, maybe a little longer than an inch. The golden digger wasp there on the right-hand side was clinging to a big blue stem. And that wasp is bigger, about 2.5 inches long. And it looks very fierce. In this case, it is holding on to a katydid. So that green insect that it's holding on to there, it was juggling, trying to get a good grip on it. And as soon as I took this picture, it picked up that katydid and flew off across the prairie. So that is a wasp, a solitary wasp. It doesn't have a colony. It doesn't live with other wasps. It's going to take that katydid to an underground burrow and lay its eggs on the katydid. And the katydid is anesthetized, and the larvae of the wasp will feed on that katydid larva until they are mature. So it's supplying a source of insect food, a rather large source of insect food. And then we have our ruby-throated hummingbirds in Wisconsin that are generally our main kind of hummingbird that we see in Wisconsin, and they are good pollinators. And this one here in the middle of this picture is visiting the giant purple hyssop, which is a plant, a very tall mint, member of the mint family, that it blooms in August or so. And here we can see it's blooming with the elm leaf goldenrod, this yellow one, which is a beautiful goldenrod. And both of these are growing in semi-shade. The hummingbirds do love this plant, even though it is not a classic red, brightly colored flower. They do love it. It has lots of good nectar. And bees will also use this plant a lot. You can see it has a lot of flowers. It blooms over a good long period of time, and it's very easy to grow. So, pollinator group that I really want to focus in on here tonight is our native bees. And here's just a picture of a bumblebee and a honeybee. They're on the New England aster, so we know that it's toward the end of the season. I always like this picture because it looks like they're holding hands. But the honeybee there on the left, you can see that it's a rather narrow, a long and rather narrow form to the body and quite hairy, including on the face. And then the bumblebee to the right-hand side there, this is a male bumblebee. You can see the rather long yellow pile or hairs on it. It might be hard to tell, but it has 4 wings, and the legs have little hooks on them. So these are all characteristics of the bees. Honeybees are not native, and bumblebees, the bumblebees that I'll talk about, are native here in Wisconsin. So bees are the most important group of pollinators, and the reason for that is that bees collect pollen and nectar to feed they use nectar to feed themselves, basically. That's a carbohydrate source, an energy source, and pollen to feed the young. So pollen has more protein. They will mix nectar with it, but and some fungi to kind of break down the materials in the pollen so that the young can digest it easily and can thrive being fed pollen. So when you see a bee flying around with a big ball of pollen on her leg, as this one is here in the photograph, that means she's collecting that pollen, bringing it back to the colony, and it's used then to feed the young that are developing in the colony. And this bumblebee here is a rusty-patched bumblebee, which I'll talk about later. But another interesting thing about this photograph is that you can see from that pollen that she's carrying that she was visiting at least three different kinds of flowers on this one gathering foraging trip. So there's kind of a yellow pollen, there's an oranger one, and then there's that white one. And the white one is the plant that she's visiting right here. That's the spirea. The other two are probably roses and maybe a lead plant or prairie clover that would be blooming at that same time. So bees are purposely collecting the pollen as they travel from flower to flower. They will have it on their bodies and they will spread it as well. But the other pollinators are just transferring pollen incidentally while they're feeding on nectar on the flowers. And there are so many connections between different plants and insects and between the pollination success and the seeding success of the plants and the success of the insects. So here we have the monarch. Of course, we're all familiar with the monarch's story. It's a specialist for larval food. It's a specialist on milkweed. So here we have an adult monarch laying her eggs on a big leaf of the common milkweed. And we see on the upper right, we see the butterfly milkweed in bloom. And milkweed flowers are very specialized and they have a very unique pollination system. So they're filled with nectar and you'll see lots and lots of insects crawling, and the nectar's right up in the open. So lots of insects can just drink it directly. But the pollen is held on little packets inserted in each flower. So the milkweed does not just have pollen like falling out of the flower and dusting everything. The pollen needs to be pulled out of the flower by getting stuck on an insect's foot, and then the insect being strong enough to pull and fly away and pull that out. And here's an example of an insect that's strong enough to do that, the bumblebee. So here's a bumblebee, and you see these little golden things that are hanging down, like little pouches hanging down from the legs of the bumblebee, and even a few up by the mandible or the mouth of the bumblebee. And those are milkweed pollinia or milkweed pollen packets. And so this bumblebee will have to fly. It was near milkweed, obviously feeding on a milkweed, and now it's going to a different plant. Hopefully it'll come to another milkweed. And those little packets have to slide into a little slot in the milkweed flower. And it seems very unlikely that it would be successful, but you usually do see a few pods on a milkweed, and that is how they are formed. Each time pollen packet slips into there, pollinates that flower, then it can develop into a pod. We know here that the monarch is not really a very effective pollinator of milkweed. Its legs are very long. It doesn't have that same kind of the strength that a bumblebee would have. So the monarch is in this way is dependent on milkweed, and the milkweed, in order to produce and reproduce its seeds, is dependent on other pollinators like bumblebees and wasps primarily to carry out its pollination. And of course, we can't just keep milkweed isn't the only plant, obviously, for monarchs to be dependent on, because a lot of times of year when monarchs are building their populations and when they're preparing for migration to Mexico at the end of the summer, they need lots of floral resource. So here at the lower left, I have the picture of the monarch nectaring on meadow blazing star. And this would be at the time of year when these butterflies are no longer in reproductive mode. They're not looking for milkweed at that point. They're not looking to lay more eggs. They're just looking to fuel up and then be on their migration. So being aware of these different relationships kind of helps us as gardeners for not only looking at what's going on in our garden, but knowing what kinds of plants and what kinds of flowering sequences we'd like to have. So this graphic here gives you an idea of what we're talking about with the native bees. So we have 500 kinds of native bees in Wisconsin. Some are very, very tiny, and you might not even ever notice them. Their world is very small. They can't fly very far. And others are rather large, like the bumblebees, and they can fly miles if they need to get their resources, or in the case of male bumblebees, just flying along at the end of the season, coming into contact with other colonies and perhaps mating with other queens and increasing genetic diversity of the colonies in that way. So these little squares represent the 500 species. And then this corner, you can see there's kind of a shaded corner. So 85%, all the majority of these species are solitary bee species. They don't have colonies. They don't live in community with each other. They're just males and females one by one, mating, the females lay eggs, provision the eggs with pollen, and their life cycle continues in that way until their life cycle may end in a few weeks. And then the next year, their young would have developed and they would hatch out and carry on the generations of those solitary bees. And I'll speak a little more about them in a moment. The corner up here that's shaded, there's about 15% of this corner up here, 15% of the bees, of our native bees, are social or semi-social. So they have some kind of either strong colony structure or semi-social. So they have some aspects of being social bees, but they're not entirely solitary, but they're not really with a tight, very well organized colony structure. So it kind of gives you an idea that the majority of bees are solitary, the minority are social. And then if we focus in on bumblebees, we have 20 species of bumblebees in Wisconsin. And so in the southern part of the state, depending on how you define it, we have about 12 to 14. And then the rest of if we consider the whole state, we would have up to 20 species of bumblebees. And that's a kind of reasonable number. You could imagine learning 20 different bees. We do detect them by color patterns, and some of the species have many more than one color pattern. So it does get a little complicated, but it's a good place to start. Bumblebees are large, they're pretty easy to recognize, and we have lots of good tools for learning them. I do want to point out here that at the lower left here, I've got a little box with a 1 in it. This is to represent the non-native or European honeybee, which is the type of honeybee that we have in that's used agriculturally in North America. It is a social species, but unlike all of the other native species, it has a perennial colony. So those colonies, they live from year to year to year, barring a problem. And so they build up in huge size. They build up to huge sizes, and their queen and their the bees would last for, they would continue to raise more bees, but the queen will stay there for longer than 1 year. That is different from all of our others. And I'll go through the bumblebee life cycle as an illustration for you in a moment. So what do we have? Ground nesting bees. This is an example from Heather Holmes, some of her materials from her website, and you'll have that on the resources. Any of her materials are extremely, she has extremely good photography and extremely accurate and detailed accounts of the different bees. So we have different groups, the mining bees, cellophane bees, and the way that their life cycle works is there is a ground nest. And you can see a diagram here at the right of a bee. They dig a little, it looks like a little volcano kind of, or they've dug the soil out of the ground at the surface. And then the bees come out and they mate, male and female mate. And then the female gathers pollen and she creates those little, what's called bee bread, where she's got the nectar and the pollen and some fungi. And it's, the best kind of food for the young bees. And she lays an egg on that pollen. And that is the food, all the food that egg will need to develop into a mature bee. You can see how they're in chambers. She seals it off so that once the egg is laid on the bee bread, she seals it off and then continues that process. And this may only go for a few weeks. She may be only using a plant that's blooming for a few weeks. And then that's her whole life cycle is just a few weeks worth of time. And then the following year, these will hatch out and it repeats again. So they do need certain types of soils that they use. They can't just be anywhere. And it's very interesting if you find an area where they are nesting like this. It's very interesting if you're at the right time of year and you can see them and see their behavior. So here are some examples from the Arboretum. So this is one at the top there. It's just a sweat bee, a very common one, but that is a ground nesting bee. So you probably will be able to see that one as you're looking around at your pollinators. This one at the bottom is a cellophane bee or Colletes species, and it's visiting the Durka, which is a woodland shrub, understory shrub that blooms early in the spring, and it blooms first before its leaves come on. It's kind of a rare shrub, actually, but it's very lovely, and you can grow it if you're lucky enough to get a source for it. And it has, you can see the pollen already sticking out, just the buds barely open, and those bees are collecting the pollen. And then here's a female bee at her nest, coming out in this case, I think. Or perhaps just looking out to see what's coming in. But you can sort of see where the soil's been brought out of the nest, and that will, so underneath the ground here are a lot of those chambers. And then we have some tiny little, here's another tiny little sweat bee. This is the same species. I'm pretty sure we have it visiting some wood. Here's a woodland flower from the summer of Vrima. Here's the wild geranium. It's collecting on that. And it looks also on this geranium like another bee has taken some petal sections off of those petals. And we'll get to that in a moment. And then here on the rose, you can just see they scramble around and gather the pollen off of the stamens there. So the cavity nesting bees is the other main group. Most of the solitary bees are ground nesting, but some of them are cavity nesting. And again, here we have different groups represented. So carpenter bees, mason bees, leaf cutter bees, and that is the one that I just mentioned, where they collect pieces and segments of leaves and petals sometimes, and they use those to line these chambers that they find in hollow stems and drilled holes that might be drilled from some other insect. They're not actually drilling the holes, but they're using crevices and little holes to use as the chambers for their egg laying. And they're, again, in this case, putting a ball of pollen, bee bread there, and then laying the egg on it, then sealing it off. And they continue that until the tube or chamber is full, and then repeat in other chambers. And there, again, these may only be living for a short time during the year. They're not active all season. I usually start seeing the leafcutter bees in June getting active. So whereas those colletes were active way earlier, before the leaves were on the trees. So they all have different times of year as well when they're active. This is the leafcutter bee. It carries the pollen on the underside of its abdomen. And in this case, of course, it's visiting a thistle, but you can see it had yellow pollen from something else that it's carrying with it. Then this little green sweat bee, that one these are all ones you could identify on bugguide.net. And then these two on the milkweed are wool carder bees. Those are actually non-native bees, and they're kind of aggressive to other bees. So they'll patrol a plant and kind of guard it, if you will. And so if a bumblebee comes in to feed on that plant, they'll come to the bumblebee and kind of tap it with these sharp spikes that they have on the back of their abdomen. And that knocks the bumblebee off of the flower for a few moments. It's not a stinger, but it does startle them and knock them down. So you can if you see a bee acting like that, then it's probably one of these wool carder bees. So the bumblebee life cycle. I want to show you what this is, because this will be important for you to interpret what you're seeing in the garden, or in wherever you're making observations of bumblebees, or wherever you notice them. And it's important to know the different parts of the life cycle, and helps you understand how this annual cycle, what's important to know about the annual cycle and where its most vulnerable parts are. So right now, the bumblebee queens for 2023 are hibernating in all one by one in small chambers underground. So here's an example. She dug this chamber last fall, and she's hibernating in it, and she will emerge. Just before she dug the chamber, she was out flying around. She was hatched, and she was out flying around, and she mated. So as she spends the winter, she's already mated, and she already can be reproducing next in the spring. So when she emerges, and this is usually for southern Wisconsin, it's usually about the middle of April, she will come out, and the queens are the only ones out at that time of year, because they haven't started their colonies yet. And she'll be searching for a nest site, like an abandoned rodent burrow, chipmunk hole, a crack in the foundation of the house, a compost pile. They're very opportunistic, hollow log. So they will look for a place like that, which suits them to start their colony. And she begins to lay her eggs. She makes a little wax pot like this and puts some nectar in there in case there's a rainy day, snowy day, poor conditions for being out and about flying around in April. And then she lays her eggs, and they're within a brood cell, and she sits on them like a chicken to keep them warm, and incubates the eggs. As they begin to hatch over a period of a few weeks, so for about the first month, she is foraging by herself, and she's just raising those young that are still developing inside of her nest. After the workers have started to emerge, so that you see in this diagram number 3, where there's some little bees near her, they are ready to begin the foraging now. And she, if all goes well, she can stay within the nest, and they can forage and bring the nectar and pollen back to the colony. And that feeds more young, she lays more eggs, and the colony will build up. So this first part of the cycle that I've just described is the building up part of the colony. And it goes right into about the middle of the summer. And that's when the colony would be at its maximum size. Several hundred bees, perhaps. So it's not thousands of bees. It's just a smaller number than that. Then at that point, the colony will switch into kind of reproductive mode. And reproduction is when she begins to stop fertilizing some of the eggs as she's laying them, and those become males. So the males are beginning to be produced in the middle of the summer, and they fly out of the colony and they do not return to the colony. So they continue on their way. They need nectar to survive and nectar to feed themselves, but they can continue to move away from the colony then, and perhaps encounter other colonies and other queens where they could mate, and then genetic diversity could be maintained. The colony also produces some future queens, and we call those gynes, and they're newly hatched. And when you see them toward the end of the summer, you can really recognize, like, a giant bee that's very fresh looking. That's probably a gyne. And so it's neat to know what those would look like for the different species, because it gives you a sense of how reproduction is going to be for the following year. The gynes are out, they're flying around, not too long, not too much. They mate, they feed, and then they dig their hole in their hibernation spot. So they need loose soil to do that. And that is the life cycle of the bumblebee. Okay, so what are some factors or stressors affecting pollinator health? And this is true not just for bees, but for other pollinators as well. And of course, we know more about some of these things than others, and we know more about certain pollinators than others. So these are puzzle pieces to fit together long term. We need to know more about all of them, but just to give you an idea of these broad factors that are affecting pollinator health in general. Pollinator habitat and nutrition, I've really been spending a bit of time with that, talking about the pollen and nectar. We need adequate and preferably abundant sources of pollen and nectar for all of our pollinators. And we need it to be continuous throughout the year, because as you could see, even from the case of bumblebees, we're collecting a little bit of nectar to store. There's not any substantial storage going on with these annual life cycles. So we need to have sources available in the environment all year long, all season long, I should say. We also need to recognize that pesticide exposure is tremendously important in pollinator health. Pesticides, we sometimes think of those as being specific to the thing that we're trying to target. So, for example, the pesticides that are used for emerald ash borer, we think of those as being specific for emerald ash borer, but they really aren't. If we treat the tree to protect it from emerald ash borer, we're also going to impact and kill the other dozens of species that are using ash as a food source for their young. So that's an important thing to remember. And mainly, for pollinator health, we encourage pesticide-free habitat for the best results. Climate change and weather, these are two things that really are affecting pollinators. We know that climate change and warming patterns are changing ranges for bumblebees. Bumblebees are kind of a cool weather animal. And so as latitudes warm, as the warming is moving up in latitude or in elevation on mountains, for example, we find that bumblebees aren't able to survive in the warmer areas, and they are kind of restricted, perhaps at the northern or upper ranges of in elevation. Weather, we're seeing some strange weather for one thing, but we're also seeing more heavy storms, maybe storms close together, heavy storms close together, flooding. And you can see that if we have a spring, which is warmer with a lot of flooding, that could affect the underground nesting preferences of, say, those ground nesting bees or the bumblebees. And then a late freeze, like an early spring with a late freeze, might affect the sources of flowering resource for them too. And so that fluctuating weather that we always, we generally, weather fluctuates, but some of these patterns that we're seeing now are definitely providing some challenges for pollinators. And disease and pests and genetics is kind of these are things that are maybe a little bit harder to for us to see and for us to address as gardeners or as landowners. But any animal or any animal that's affected by poor nutrition or exposed to pesticides or stressed by weather is going to be more susceptible to disease and pests. And so sometimes pests are brought in inadvertently and they travel through a native population. Genetics part of it means that if we have declining populations and the populations are very small relative to what they are and they're disconnected from each other, they can't really, they're small and they're disjunct, then there won't be then the genetic diversity decreases and we won't have as healthy a population to deal with some of these other factors as well. So remember that it's not just the individual factors, it's also the combinations of these factors and the interactions of them. So what can we do about that? Some things are harder to do than others because we might not know what diseases are affecting the bees. But one thing we can do is really get at the habitat side. And here's a very simple formula that I like to present, which is native plants equals pollinator habitat. Sure, there are plants that pollinators are using, ornamentals and other plants that we may have in our gardens, crops, vegetables, and so forth. But native plants as pollinator habitat provides us with a really good base habitat. And if we grow native plants near our vegetables and we grow native plants with our ornamentals or near our ornamentals, then we really have a kind of ideal situation. So this is the native plant garden at the Arboretum, kind of midsummer, perfect pollinator. This would be a perfect day for us all to be there looking for pollinators together because we see the mountain mint here in the center, the liatris with its purple spikes, the white spikes to the right are the culver's root. In the background, you can see the monarda or bee balm. So lots of different pollinator plants, favorite pollinator plants are blooming right in this picture. And that is really an ideal situation. We want to, so here's just some general principles and think about these as you put together, as you are thinking about your own area that you take care of or that you're helping take care of, like in case of a community garden, anything you can do in these directions of these suggestions will increase the value to pollinators. So maximizing the number of plants and the diversity of the native plants in the landscape. This is a very early season picture here in the woodland. So the trees have barely got their leaves on. We've got the the Virginia bluebells. The little pink one is the spring beauty, and there's some woodland phlox in the picture. So this is a case of a little, diversity at an early point in the season, which is quite important, especially for those spring emerging species that are so active right away in the spring. We want to have a seasonal succession of flowering. So that means something's in bloom all the way along, and preferably more than one thing is in bloom all the way along the season. So spring, summer, late summer, fall, or early fall, that at all those times we'd be able to go out and in a landscape area, we would find different things in bloom. And we don't want to forget about trees. So for example, if you have a basswood tree, that will be blooming copiously, and the bees will be using that, maybe even at the exclusion of some of the ground flora. We can see different forms of flowers. So for the different pollinators, different kinds of bees, even, we would have different shapes of flowers and different species of flowers, different plant families represented, because the different species do have definite preferences in those areas. And then, of course, other pollinators are going to be visiting too, not just bees. So we have different plants that are suitable for butterflies, wasps, moths, and so forth. I always suggest to people to plant the straight species, and by that I just mean the native species, the one that hasn't been developed into a cultivar or a selected or bred into a different form. But it can be some of the cultivars are very useful to pollinators. Pollinators will visit them. They actually are beneficial, even in a straight comparison with the wild type. So it's tricky. It just depends. And here is an example that I like to mention to people. If you're in Madison around June or so, late May, early June, the West Madison Agricultural Station here in Madison has a Baptisia demonstration garden, among other things. And they have all these different forms of Baptisia. And this white one on the right is the native one, but these other color forms, and you can definitely see which bumblebees are using all of them. This happens to be the same species of bumblebee in both of these photographs, the black and gold bumblebee, which is our biggest bumblebee. And so it's really fun to take pictures and see which forms are being used the most. And there is a scientific literature developing on these comparisons. So there is a little bit more information about which cultivars are actually very beneficial to pollinators, because some cultivars have been are so modified that they really aren't visited by the pollinators that you would expect for that species. So it may look the same to us, but it doesn't look the same to the insects. So it bears more study. We like to emphasize native plants that are known to promote pollinators. So it's kind of another extension of what I just said. But here we have a screenshot of a Midwest plant guide that we came up with a few years ago with the Fish and Wildlife Service for the rusty patch bumblebee. Just it suggests that in the early, mid, and late bloom periods, what plants to use. Gave a little bit of information about the habitat that the plant needs in order to thrive. And I will just say that we've developed another set of lists now. So the seasonal plant list for the rusty patch bumblebee in particular, which will help attract a lot of different kinds of bumblebees as well, is in your resource list that you'll have access to later. In the Natural Areas Journal, there is a list that's based on historical and current observations for rusty patch. And then Judy Cardine has an online resource where she's compiled all of the photographs that she and her husband have taken while highlighting the plants and their seasonal timing for you. So those are two things that you can check out about which species will be good to grow, especially for bumblebees. Here's the warning about pesticides. We like to avoid the pesticides, especially in systemic insecticides. So these are the ones that are in the plant tissue. The plants are usually treated maybe in production, and the insecticides are in the plant tissue, and then they're held in the flowers, in the leaves, in the stems, in the pollen and the nectar, and that can have a deleterious effect on the reproduction of the pollinator that's using those resources. And with nursery plants, these particular plants are from a native plant nursery, so I know they're not treated, but when you buy them at another source, you want to make sure that they have not been pre-treated. Make sure they're marked, neonic free, pesticide free, that kind of thing. And, I think customer pressure and customer desire is going to help the green industry move toward plants that have not been pre-treated. If you prefer those, be sure you tell the nurseries that that's what you want. As far as the garden itself goes, we like to have some little like wilder areas, if possible, where you've got logs, rocks, you've got leaf litter, you've got kind of buffer areas where it's not, not all tidied up in a way. My volunteers like to refer to this as Susan, so you're telling me to not work so hard. And I guess that's what I'm saying. If you avoid using landscape fabric or thick layers of rocks for mulch, that will help, because the ground surface is useful for the ground nesting bees and also for the bumblebees as they dig in bare soil or loose soil to get their hibernation chambers. And you can use plants, just growing more plants nearby, close together, to kind of do a greener mulch for your garden areas. At our garden, we leave the plant material standing up over the winter. So right now it's just basically the extension of what you see in this top picture. And then we trim it in the spring. So unfortunately, we don't have any snow on the ground here in Madison, but there you can see that the garden areas in this lower picture, you can see the garden areas with the plants still kind of sticking up. That's handy. If you're in a public space, it's handy to have the plant material still there when you have snow, because people don't tend to make their path directly across your garden bed. And you can see here people have made a path, but it's not going right through the garden bed. Just a practical little tip if you're in a public space. And if you're in a neighborhood or in a public space, it's good to have some interpretive signs explain what your garden is and what it's doing and what it's accomplishing, because people are very interested in pollinator gardening and pollinator habitat and protecting pollinators. And so highlighting that is really a good idea. This is a sign from some years ago from the Xerces Society. They have another design now, but you can make your own signs. There's also Wild Ones has signs like this, and other organizations that you can highlight what you're doing and get a conversation going with people. Speaking of conversation, we want to share what we're doing with the community. Children, as that top picture, or with adult groups, as we have in the lower picture here, where we're collecting seeds and harvesting the seeds, and then of course sharing seeds, or including people in that harvest, and then maybe with the option that they would have seeds and be able to start those seeds in their own garden later on. So I want to share with you really quickly, and I'm really running over time, but I want to share with you really quickly how we got started on bumblebees. And we just started with one photo. We didn't know anything about our bumblebees in our garden at that time, but in 2010, someone sent us this photo, told us a story of this bumblebee, which is very rare, lost over most of its range. Here was a picture taken at the Arboretum the previous summer, and had we seen any more of them? And we hadn't. So we were kind of embarrassed, actually, that we didn't know anything much about our bumblebees. We immediately were asking questions like, which bumblebee species are present at the Arboretum? How about elsewhere in Wisconsin? Which plant species are visited by each of the bumblebee species? Do they all visit the same ones? And how can we promote pollinator conservation and education? So we began by taking pictures of bumblebees. That is a good way to learn your identifications. Unlike for most insects, you can actually, with photographs, you can usually get pretty far with your IDs. You like to have a picture of the back of the bumblebee, and you just do this by letting the bumblebee walk around on the flowers, and you are taking multiple pictures of that same bee. So I took this picture, and that showed her back really well. This picture showed her side view really well. I can see the patterning here on the head. And then this one's kind of a front face view. So if I needed to know that, I could see the shape of her face there from the front. And then as you take a series of pictures of a bumblebee, be sure you take a spacer photo before you start taking pictures of the next bee, so that you know how many, you know which one's which along your photo stream. This one identified as a lemon cuckoo bee, that's Bombus citrinus. She's a female in this case. Very interesting nest parasite bumblebee. So we were glad to find, after doing this for some years, that we have 13 types of bumblebees at the Arboretum. This is the long list, and I wouldn't be surprised as you begin to accumulate pictures and accumulate knowledge about the bumblebees, if you would find that you have a surprisingly larger number of bumblebees present than you thought. And this is the main ID that I want to leave you with today. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. It has 2 yellow segments on the abdomen of the bee. So this back part here is the abdomen of the bee, yellow and yellow with a brownish or rusty patch toward the front of the second segment there. So once you've seen this pattern, you probably would be able to recognize a rusty patch bumblebee, and don't be confused by the lookalikes. Make sure that you see a little yellow bit behind that brownish patch. And if you do see this bee, then we would love it if you would join Bumblebee Brigade and submit your photos to Bumblebee Brigade and document it. For perhaps you'll have a new record for another county, a new location, and you'll be on your way to being involved with bumblebee conservation. Here is Bumblebee Brigade information. The things we get from the picture besides identification can include behavior, like here's rusty patch bumblebee, nectar robbing. It's poking its proboscis right into the tube of the flower instead of going through the tube of the flower. And rusty patch is one of the only bumblebees that does that. So it's an interesting behavioral feature. We have the emerging and overwintering gines that we might find or observe. And in the case of rusty patch, she doesn't even have a rusty patch. So we want to learn that pattern and look for her. And then we learn about the way they use flowers and how different bumblebee species use different flowers. There's resources to identify the bumblebees in your photos. And if you're in Wisconsin, the best place to start with a lot of resources is Bumblebee Brigade. But there are other books and websites and Bumblebee Watch, which would be a site that you could use if you were visiting other states in the country. These are the kinds of sheets that you'd use to learn your IDs. So we're looking at these color patterns again and just getting into the details. And a lot of those resources are available on Bumblebee Brigade. And where are people finding the rusty patch bumblebee? Well, here you can see the map. The grade-in area, including going all the way to the East Coast, is the historic range of rusty patch. And the areas that you see dotted here with red are the locations where rusty patch has been found. And the yellow shows a zone of suitable habitat around those sightings. And you can see that the cities are not bad places. And the reason for that is we have a lot of people in the cities who are looking for rusty patch, finding it, and growing gardens that will foster it. So that is this map. There is a map on the Fish and Wildlife Service website that will be updated with the latest data. This one doesn't have the very last year of data, but as soon as that Fish and Wildlife website is updated, you'll see the most current sites. And you can see how nicely widespread in Wisconsin we have sightings, but there's still a lot of places for people to keep looking and keep documenting this very rare federally endangered bee. So this is my thank you slide. I just want to thank all the people who work on the garden project and also on the bumblebee monitoring. And this link here is the link that you can go to, and there you'll find the handout that I have been talking about all this time. So thank you so much for your attention, and Jess, if you want to do questions now, I'm perfectly happy to do that. Sorry that I ran over time.